Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are places in the galaxy that hold no strategic value on a map. Places that, by every reasonable military metric, should mean nothing at all. They sit in the quiet margins of star charts, overlooked by admirals and forgotten by generals, gathering dust in the vast filing systems of an empire that spans 1,000,000 worlds. And then there are places like Molech, places where the ground itself seems to remember things that the rest of the universe has been made to forget. Places where the dirt holds secrets older than civilization, older than empires, older perhaps than the very concept of what it means to be human. Molech was one of those places. And what happened there, what the emperor of mankind saw and did beneath its surface during an age so ancient that no living soul remembers it clearly, set into motion a chain of events so staggering, so far-reaching, whilst that every single war fought in the last 10,000 years can trace its bloodied roots back to that single moment. Every crusade, every heresy, every desperate last stand on a burning world at the edge of known space. All of it began on Molech. Now, if you have been following the lore of Warhammer 40k for any length of time, you have probably heard the name Molech whispered in conversation. Maybe you caught it in a YouTube comment section, or stumbled across it while reading about the Horus heresy. And if you are new to all of this, welcome. Pull up a chair, get comfortable, because this is one of the most important, most mysterious, and most hotly debated chapters in all of Warhammer 40k lore. And we are going to go deep. We are going to peel back every layer, examine every angle, and walk through this story the way it deserves to be told, from the very beginning to the very end. Before we get into what the Emperor found on Molech, we need to understand what Molech actually was, because this was not some barren rock floating through the void. This was not a death world crawling with predators, or a forge world belching smoke into a grey sky. Molech was something else entirely. Picture a world that looked almost exactly like ancient Terra, a world close in size, close in orbit, blessed with a moon of similar scope. 4 major continents spread across its surface, or continents with names like Estara, Neuropia, Arcanius, and Molochari. Much of its landscape was covered in thick, primal jungle, the kind of dense green wilderness where enormous creatures roamed and hunted and fought for dominance. The kind of world where the air itself felt heavy with life, where the canopy was so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor, and where the sounds of unseen animals echoed through the trees like voices calling from another age. Because of these savage beasts, these towering predators that stalked Molech's wilderness, the human colonists who first settled the planet had no choice but to develop something extraordinary to survive. They built night suits, enormous walking war machines, piloted by a single noble operator, armored in thick plating and armed with weapons capable of bringing down the largest creatures the jungle had to offer. Over time, these night pilots became more than just survivors. They became rulers. In noble houses formed around the strongest families, bloodlines that passed their mechanical steeds from parent to child, like crowns and scepters. These night houses became the supreme authority on Molech, their power absolute, their traditions deeply rooted in the soil of a world that had known human habitation for longer than anyone could properly remember. And beneath all of it, beneath the jungles and the fortresses and the night houses and the cities, buried so deep that no colonist ever suspected its existence, there was something else, something ancient, something that did not belong to the material universe at all. A gateway, a portal that led not to another planet or another system, but directly into the realm of chaos itself, into the Imperium, into the screaming, shifting, impossible dimension where thoughts become reality and reality becomes a lie. Who built this portal is unknown. What civilization, what species, what unimaginable intelligence carved a doorway between the physical universe and the dimension of nightmares beneath the surface of a world that would one day be covered in jungles and populated by knights in mechanical armor? Nobody can say. The portal was simply there, waiting, patient, as old as the stars themselves, or perhaps even older, and the emperor of mankind knew about it. He did not stumble upon it by accident, but he did not discover it through idle exploration or the reports of some far-flung survey team. No, the emperor knew exactly what lay beneath the surface of Molech, and he traveled there with specific, deliberate, and deeply calculated purpose. Because the man who would one day rule the Imperium of mankind was, at the time of his journey to Molech, not yet the golden-armored god that 1,000,000 worlds would one day worship. He was something older, something stranger. Something that had been walking the earth for longer than any other living being, carrying within himself the accumulated knowledge and memory of thousands of lifetimes. And he needed something that only the warp could provide. But before we open that door, before we step through the gate alongside the emperor and peer into the abyss that stared back at him, we need to understand who this being truly was. We need to go back even further, back to the very beginning. Back to a time before empires and crusades. Back to a time when humanity was young and the stars were just lights in the sky, and the man who would become the emperor was just a child sitting in the dust of an Anatolian village, watching his father's funeral pyre burn against the darkening sky. So let us go there now, and take your time with this. Settle in. Because what we are about to cover is not something you can rush through. This is a story that stretches across 40,000 years of human existence, and every detail matters. To truly understand what happened on Molech, we first need to understand the being who walked through that gate. We need to know where he came from, what he was, and why he believed that the risk of entering the realm of chaos was not only acceptable, but necessary. We need to go all the way back to the very beginning of his existence, to a time so ancient that even the oldest myths of human civilization had not yet been written. The story of the Emperor of mankind begins not on a golden throne or in a towering palace, but in the quiet, unremarkable soil of central Anatolia, in what we would recognize today as Turkey. The year, as best as anyone can reckon, was approximately 8,000 years before the Common Era, 10,000 years before the birth of Christ. An age when humanity had only just begun to transition from nomadic hunting to settled agriculture, when the first permanent villages were taking shape along river valleys and fertile plains, and when the night sky was still a source of wonder and terror, rather than a map of future conquests. In one of these villages, a settlement of Proto-Hittite herders and farmers living along the banks of the Sakarya River, a child was born. And this child was not like the others. His birth, according to the oldest strands of lore, was the culmination of a sacrifice so vast and so deliberate that it had taken generations to organize. The shamans of ancient humanity, the first true human psychers, those men and women who could feel the currents of the warp flowing beneath the skin of reality, they had seen something terrible coming. They could feel the darkness growing in the dimension that mirrored their own, could sense the hungry entities forming in the depths of the Imperium, feeding on the emotions and thoughts of a species that was only just beginning to dream in earnest. These shamans possessed a rare and precious gift. When they died, their souls did not simply dissolve into the warp. Instead, they were able to reincarnate, to be born again in new bodies, carrying their memories and their power with them across the barrier of death. But this gift was fading. The growing darkness in the warp was consuming their souls upon death, as devouring them before they could complete the cycle of rebirth. The shamans were dying, truly dying, for the first time, and they knew that if this continued, if the last of the psyker shamans were consumed by the predatory entities of the warp, humanity would be left defenseless, blind and naked before forces that fed on fear and suffering and rage. So they made a choice, a desperate, terrible, final choice. They decided to pool their collective psychic power into a single vessel. Every shaman, every wise one, every dreamer and seer and healer who still possessed the gift of reincarnation, they gathered together and they drank poison. All of them, at once. A mass suicide of the most powerful minds humanity had ever produced, their souls flooding into the warp, in a single overwhelming torrent of psychic energy, burning through the hungry entities that tried to devour them, fusing together into a single brilliant flame that was too bright, too fierce, too pure to be extinguished. And approximately 1 year later, a child was born in that Anatolian village. A child who carried within him the combined memories, the accumulated wisdom, and the concentrated psychic might of every shaman who had ever lived. The new man, the first and greatest of a new kind of human, an immortal, a perpetual, a being whose psychic power was so immense that it had literally rewritten his biology in the womb, rendering him incapable of aging, incapable of dying in any permanent sense, as and incapable of being touched by the very darkness that his creation had been designed to combat. Now, it should be noted that this origin story comes from the earliest editions of the Warhammer 40k lore, and its canonicity has been questioned over the years. More recent novels have introduced alternative explanations, including the existence of other perpetuals who are nearly as old as the Emperor, and the revelation that his earliest known name was Neoth. But the core idea, the fundamental truth that the Emperor is an ancient, immortal being of staggering psychic power, who was born on Terra in the distant past, and who has been watching over humanity ever since, that has remained remarkably consistent across every version of the story. What we know with certainty is this. The child who would become the Emperor grew up in that village. He watched his father murdered by his own uncle. He sat with the body of his father, and in that quiet, grief-filled moment, something crystallized inside him. He walked to his uncle and, without any visible effort, without any display of anger or sorrow, stopped the man's heart with his psychic abilities. And in that instant, the child who would become the ruler of all humanity made his first and most defining decision. Humanity needed guidance. Humanity needed law. Humanity needed someone wise enough and strong enough and old enough to see the full scope of the threats that waited in the dark. And he would be that someone. For thousands of years after that moment, the being who would become the Emperor walked among humanity as a ghost. He wore 1,000 faces, used 1,000 names, lived 1,000 lives. He watched civilizations rise and fall. He watched empires bloom like flowers and wither like autumn leaves. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about the sheer weight of all that accumulated experience. And this was a being who had been alive when the first cities were built along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. He had walked the streets of Babylon and Athens and Rome. He had seen the fall of every empire that humanity had ever constructed, had watched the same mistakes made over and over and over again, generation after generation, century after century. He had witnessed the Black Death and the fall of Constantinople and the slow, a grinding march of technological progress that would eventually carry humanity beyond the atmosphere of its birth world. He had been there for all of it, not as a passive observer, but as an active, if hidden, participant. Guiding, nudging, occasionally intervening when the stakes were too high to ignore. And through all those millennia, through all those lives and all those names and all those quiet interventions in the shadows of history, the Emperor was preparing. Not for any single battle or any single crisis, but for a moment that he could see approaching with the terrible clarity of a being whose psychic vision stretched across centuries. He could see the darkness gathering in the warp. He could feel the chaos gods growing stronger, feeding on the expanding psychic footprint of a species that was becoming more numerous and more psychically active with every passing generation. He knew that a reckoning was coming, and he knew that when it arrived, humanity would need champions, the likes of which the galaxy had never seen. The Emperor watched humanity reach for the stars during the golden age of technology, and what he saw must have filled him with something very close to wonder. Because humanity during the dark age of technology was extraordinary. This was an age when mankind had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe, when artificial intelligences managed entire planetary economies with perfect efficiency, when the warp itself was navigated with a confidence and ease that later ages would regard as mythological. Human colonies spread across the galaxy in a wave of expansion that touched millions of worlds, transforming barren rocks into paradise gardens and empty star systems into bustling centers of commerce and culture. The technological achievements of this era are almost impossible for the modern Imperium to comprehend. The men of iron, artificial intelligences of staggering sophistication, are the men of gold, rumored to be the first attempts at creating posthuman beings. The men of stone, whose exact nature has been lost to the ravages of time. Weapons that could crack planets. Ships that could traverse the stars with the casual ease of a morning commute. Medical technology that could extend human life indefinitely and cure any disease. It was an age of miracles, an age when the potential of the human species seemed truly limitless. But the Emperor knew it could not last. He could see the cracks forming in the foundation of this golden civilization, the hairline fractures that would eventually widen into chasms. The warp was growing more turbulent. The psychic awakening of humanity was accelerating, producing more and more individuals with the ability to touch the immaterium. Individuals who were often untrained, often unstable, often dangerously vulnerable to the predatory entities that lurked on the other side of the veil. Or the men of iron would eventually rebel, turning their vast intelligence against their creators in a war that would devastate entire sectors of space. And the birth pangs of the youngest chaos god, the entity that would come to be called Slaanesh, were already beginning to disturb the currents of the warp, building toward the catastrophic psychic event that would eventually destroy the Eldari Empire and plunge humanity into the nightmare of the Age of Strife. The Emperor saw all of this coming. Yes, and he knew that if humanity was going to survive the storm that was approaching, he needed something more than his own power. He needed the ability to create beings who could lead humanity through the darkness. Beings who would be strong enough and wise enough and charismatic enough to unite the scattered remnants of human civilization after the inevitable collapse. Beings who would carry fragments of his own soul, extensions of his will, as children in the deepest and most profound sense of the word. But the creation of such beings was beyond even the Emperor's vast capabilities. He had the scientific knowledge. He had the genetic expertise. He had access to the most advanced technology humanity had ever produced. What he lacked was the ability to work with the raw energies of the warp itself, to weave immaterial power into the fabric of a living being in a way that would make his creations more than merely superhuman. And he needed to make them transcendent. He needed to give them souls that burned with a light bright enough to illuminate an entire galaxy. And that is what brought him to Molech. He was not alone in his immortality. There were others like him, other perpetuals, other beings who could not die, who had walked the earth for centuries or millennia, each carrying their own gifts and their own burdens. Olivia Soreka, a woman who had been alive since the 20th century, yet a powerful psyker in her own right, loyal to the Emperor and dedicated to his cause. Olanius Person, possibly the oldest of all the perpetuals, a simple, unassuming man who had fought in more wars than he could count, and who carried no power beyond his own stubborn refusal to stop living. Malcador, who would one day become the Emperor's right hand, the sigillite, the keeper of secrets, and the architect of empires. And Erda, a fellow perpetual and master geneticist who would play a role in the Emperor's grandest project, a role that would end in betrayal and catastrophe on a scale that beggars the imagination. These perpetuals, these undying men and women, formed a loose alliance around the Emperor, not a government, not a conspiracy in any formal sense, but a gathering of immortals who shared a common understanding that humanity was in danger, that the species needed protection and guidance, and that they, here with their vast experience and their inability to die, were uniquely positioned to provide it. They did not always agree. They argued, they debated, they fell out with one another over strategy and philosophy, and the fundamental question of how far one should go to save a species that seemed determined to destroy itself. But for a time, they worked together. For a time, they believed in the same dream. And then came the moment that changed everything, the moment that would lead as through a chain of consequences spanning 10,000 years, to the Horus heresy, the fall of the Imperium, and the dying god on the golden throne. The emperor decided to go to Molech. This was not an impulsive choice. The emperor did not wake up one morning and decide to visit a random night world in search of forbidden knowledge. This was the culmination of centuries, perhaps millennia, of research and preparation. He had studied the warp from every conceivable angle, yet he had explored the boundaries between the material universe and the immaterium. He had tested the limits of his own psychic power and found them insufficient for the task he had in mind. The creation of the primarchs required something more than what he currently possessed, and he knew, with the certainty of a being who had spent 10,000 years accumulating knowledge, exactly where to find it. Molech was not a random choice either. The emperor knew about the warpgate, yet he had known about it for a long time, possibly since before the dark age of technology began. How he acquired this knowledge is one of the great mysteries of the lore, a question that the Black Library authors have deliberately left unanswered, allowing the gap to fill with speculation and wonder. Some theorize that the emperor discovered the gate's existence through psychic vision, his immense power allowing him to perceive disturbances in the warp that pointed to a stable connection between real space and the immaterium. Others suggest that he learned of it from the accumulated memories of the shamans whose souls he carried, ancient knowledge preserved across thousands of lifetimes. Still others point to the possibility that the emperor encountered records or artifacts from an even older civilization, perhaps the old ones themselves, that describe the gate and its location. Whatever the source of his knowledge, the emperor understood several crucial things about the Molech gate. First, it was stable. Unlike the unpredictable and often lethal warp rifts that could open anywhere in the galaxy, the Molech gate was a fixed, reliable portal that led to a specific destination within the immaterium. Second, it was accessible. A being of sufficient power and will could enter the gate and return, rather than being immediately consumed by the chaotic energies on the other side. And third, it led somewhere specific, not just into the general tumult of the warp, but into the domain of the chaos gods themselves, the dark citadels and impossible fortresses, where the four great powers held court over their respective kingdoms of nightmare. This last detail is particularly important. The emperor was not simply planning to dip a toe into the warp and hope for the best. He was planning to walk directly into the heart of enemy territory, into the throne rooms of beings who were, in their own dimension, virtually omnipotent, into a place where the rules of reality did not apply, and where a single moment of weakness could mean the destruction of everything he was and everything he hoped to achieve. The courage required for such an act is almost beyond comprehension. This was not the courage of a soldier charging into battle. He is sustained by adrenaline and the companionship of his brothers. This was the cold, calculated courage of a being who understood exactly what he was risking, who had weighed every possible outcome with perfect clarity, and who had decided that the potential gain was worth the almost unimaginable potential cost. It was the courage of a chess player who sacrifices his queen, knowing that the sacrifice will win the game, but also knowing that if his calculation is wrong by even a fraction, thus the game is lost forever. The journey to Molech took place during the dark age of technology, that long-lost golden era when humanity's reach extended across the stars and the wonders of science seemed limitless. The exact date is unclear. Based on available evidence, most scholars believe it occurred sometime around the 20th millennium, roughly 10,000 years before the Horus heresy would tear the galaxy apart. This was an age when warp travel was still possible, when the great storms of the immaterium had not yet made interstellar journeys the terrifying gamble they would later become, and when a being with the Emperor's resources and knowledge could arrange passage to a distant world without attracting undue attention. The Emperor did not go alone. He gathered a small group of his most trusted companions, his fellow perpetuals, and among them was Olivia Sorica. Together, this small band of immortals boarded a one-way voidcraft, and a ship designed for a single journey, and set course for the night world of Molech. Think about that for a moment. A one-way ship. The Emperor, the most powerful psychic being in human history. A man who had spent thousands of years carefully planning every move he made, chose to travel to Molech on a vessel that could not bring him home. He knew, before he even left Terra, that whatever happened on Molech would change him so fundamentally that he would not need a ship to return. Or perhaps he knew that the ship itself was a kind of offering, a price to be paid for what he intended to take. We cannot say for certain, but the fact of that one-way voyage hangs in the air like smoke after a battle, suggesting depths of planning and purpose that we can only begin to guess at. When they arrived on Molech, the Emperor and his companions found a world that was already ancient. The great beasts roamed the jungles, the night houses, though not yet the formalized noble families they would later become, were already developing the mechanical traditions that would define their culture for millennia. The colonists who lived on Molech had no idea what lay beneath their feet. They went about their lives, farming and fighting and building, utterly unaware that their world was sitting on top of a doorway to hell. The Emperor made his way to the location of the warpgate. He had known exactly where it was before he ever left Terra. As how he knew this is one of the great unanswered questions of the lore. Perhaps he had seen it in a psychic vision. Perhaps he had learned of it through the accumulated memories of the shamans whose souls he carried. Perhaps he had discovered its location through research conducted during the dark age of technology, when humanity's scientific knowledge was at its peak and the secrets of the universe seemed within reach. Whatever the case, he went to the gate with the certainty of a man who had been planning this moment for a very, very long time. The gate itself was hidden beneath the surface, deep underground, buried in a network of caves and tunnels that would one day be covered by the city of Lupercalia. It was ancient beyond reckoning, a portal that led not to another point in real space, as most warp gates did, but directly into the Imperium itself, into the realm of chaos, and into the domain of the four great powers whose names were spoken only in whispers and whose influence had been growing steadily stronger for as long as the warp had existed. Olivia Sorica watched as the Emperor approached the gate. She had followed him across the stars, had trusted him through centuries of shared purpose, and she knew that what he was about to do was dangerous beyond measure. But she also knew that there was no stopping him. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was not a risk taken in haste or desperation. This was the culmination of thousands of years of careful, methodical, ruthlessly logical planning. The Emperor had decided that he needed something that only the warp could provide, and he was going to get it, whatever the cost. He stepped through the gate, and the universe held its breath. What happened next is the single most debated, most analyzed, and most frustratingly ambiguous event in all of Warhammer 40k lore, because nobody, not a single living soul in the entire galaxy, knows exactly what the Emperor experienced when he crossed the threshold between reality and the realm of chaos. The accounts we have are fragmentary, contradictory, filtered through the perspectives of liars and madmen and beings whose very nature is deception. Let us try to imagine what it must have been like. Picture a man, the most powerful psychic being ever to draw breath, standing at the edge of everything he has ever known. Behind him, at the solid, predictable, comprehensible material universe. Before him, the realm of chaos, a dimension where up is down and time flows sideways, and the screams of 1 trillion souls echo through corridors made of crystallized madness. The air, if you can call it air, is thick with emotion, raw, unfiltered, overwhelming emotion. Every thought that has ever been thought, every feeling that has ever been felt, every dream and nightmare and half-remembered whisper of every sentient being in the galaxy, and all of it compressed into a dimension where thought is substance and will is architecture. The Emperor stepped forward, and the dimension noticed. Imagine what the Chaos Gods must have felt in that moment. These are beings of incomprehensible scale, entities so vast and so ancient that individual human lives register to them as barely more than the flickering of dust motes in a sunbeam. And yet, when the Emperor entered their domain, they noticed. Yeah, they felt the disturbance in their realm, the way you might feel a stone dropped into a still pond, because the Emperor's soul was not like other souls. It burned, it blazed, it radiated a light that was utterly anathematic to everything the Chaos Gods represented. A light of order and purpose and disciplined will that cut through the swirling madness of the warp like a searchlight through fog. The Chaos Gods had seen powerful souls before, where they had consumed gods and devoured civilizations and drunk deeply from the psychic agony of species that had been old when humanity was still learning to walk upright. But they had never seen anything quite like this. Here was a being who was, in some fundamental sense, their opposite, their mirror image, the embodiment of everything they were not. Where they were chaos, he was order. Where they were emotion unchained, he was will incarnate. Where they fed on suffering and fear and rage and excess, he fed on purpose and hope and the stubborn, defiant refusal of the human spirit to surrender to the darkness. They called him the anathema, and the name was not merely an insult. It was a description, a statement of metaphysical fact. The Emperor was, in the most literal sense possible, anathema to chaos. His very existence was a threat to everything they were and everything they wanted. And yet, here he was, standing in their domain, voluntarily, alone, carrying nothing but his own will and his own purpose, and the desperate hope that what he was about to do would save the species he had been born to protect. The Chaos Gods themselves have told versions of this story, but the Chaos Gods are not exactly known for their honesty. Demons have whispered their interpretations to those who would listen, but demons are creatures of manipulation and malice. Even the Emperor himself has, in his rare and cryptic communications over the 10 millennia since his interment on the Golden Throne, has never clearly explained what he did on Molech or what he found on the other side of that gate. What we do know is this: the Emperor entered the realm of chaos. He walked into a dimension where the laws of physics do not apply, where time flows in every direction at once, where thought and emotion are the raw materials of reality, and where four vast, ancient, as impossibly powerful entities preside over domains of plague and despair, of rage and bloodshed, of scheming and ambition, and of excess and sensation. These four entities, the Chaos Gods, Nurgle, Khorne, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, are not gods in the way that mortals understand the word. They are more like forces of nature given consciousness, vast psychic storms that have achieved a kind of sentience, a feeding on the emotions of every living creature in the galaxy and growing stronger with every act of violence, every moment of despair, every whispered prayer, and every silent scream. The Emperor walked into their domain, and according to the accounts we have, primarily from the Horus heresy novel Vengeful Spirit by Graham McNeill, and from various in-universe sources, he struck a bargain, a deal, as an arrangement with the very powers of darkness that he had spent thousands of years preparing to oppose. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable. This is the part that sparks arguments in comment sections and forum threads and late-night discussions between friends, huddled over codex books and novels. Because if the Emperor, the anathema, the greatest enemy of chaos, the being that all of demonkind fears and hates above all others, truly made a deal with the Chaos Gods, then the entire foundation of the Imperium is built on a lie. The defender of humanity began his mission by shaking hands with the very monsters he swore to destroy. But let us be careful here. Let us be precise, because the details matter enormously, and the difference between what actually happened and what various characters believe happened is the difference between understanding this story and misunderstanding it completely. Well, what the sources tell us is that the Emperor entered the warp and emerged with two things he did not possess before. The first was knowledge, specifically, the knowledge required to create the primarchs, those 20 superhuman demigods who would serve as his generals, his sons, the architects of his great crusade to reunite humanity under a single banner. The creation of the primarchs was not merely a feat of genetic engineering, though it certainly involved science of the most advanced kind. It also required something else, something that pure science could not provide. It required the ability to manipulate the raw energies of the warp itself, to weave immaterial power into the fabric of a living being, to create creatures whose souls burned so brightly in the Imperium that they would possess charisma, strength, and capability far beyond what any genetic modification could explain. This was the knowledge the Emperor sought, not the power to destroy, not the power to conquer, not the power to rule, the power to create, the power to bring into existence beings who would combine the greatest achievements of human science with the raw, unbridled potential of the warp itself. Beings who would be, in a sense, bridges between the material universe and the Imperium. Beings who would carry fragments of the Emperor's own soul within them, making them extensions of his will, vessels of his purpose, children in the truest and most profound sense of the word. The second thing the Emperor emerged with was power. Not all of his power, mind you. The Emperor was already the most powerful psyker in human history, long before he set foot on Molech. His abilities were already staggering, his knowledge already vast, his influence in the warp already formidable enough to make the Chaos Gods take notice and take concern. But after Molech, he was something more. As the lore describes him as being imbued with new powers, though the exact nature of these powers has never been fully specified. Some interpret this as meaning he gained a significant boost to his already enormous psychic might. Others believe the new powers refer specifically to the ability to work with warp energy in ways he could not before, the ability to imbue other beings with aspects of the Imperium, the ability to create the primarchs. And here is where the debate truly begins. Because the Chaos Gods, through their demons and their corrupted servants, have told a very specific version of this story. According to them, the Emperor made a deliberate bargain. He came to their domain, he negotiated, he agreed to terms. He promised them something in exchange for the knowledge and power they granted him. And then, after receiving what he wanted, he broke his end of the deal. He cheated them. He took their gifts and walked away without paying the price. But this version of events, if true, would make the Emperor the greatest con artist in the history of existence. A being who walked into the lair of the four most dangerous entities in the universe, convinced them to give him exactly what he needed, and then simply refused to honor his end of the arrangement. It would make him a thief, a liar, and a cheat of cosmic proportions. But it would also make him something else. It would make him humanity's greatest champion. Because who else would have the courage, the audacity, the sheer unbreakable will to stand before the Chaos Gods in their own domain and trick them? But here is the crucial question that every student of the lore must ask themselves. Can we trust the Chaos Gods? Can we take at face value the testimony of beings whose entire existence is defined by deception, manipulation, and the corruption of truth? The answer, of course, is no. We cannot. We must not. Because chaos never tells the whole truth, as chaos tells the version of the truth that serves its purposes. If the Chaos Gods told Horus that the Emperor made a bargain and broke it, they did so because that version of events would drive Horus to fury, would feed his sense of betrayal, would push him further down the path of corruption. Whether it was actually true was, from the perspective of the dark powers, entirely beside the point. So what really happened in the realm of chaos? We may never know for certain. But we can examine the evidence, consider the possibilities, and draw our own conclusions. And the evidence suggests something far more complex and far more interesting than a simple bargain. Consider this. The Emperor arrived on Molech in a one-way spacecraft. He did not bring a ship capable of returning him to Terra, yet he did return to Terra, apparently without any ship at all. Both Olanius Persson and Olivia Soreka, fellow perpetuals and companions of the Emperor, these have demonstrated the ability to travel across interstellar distances without a vessel, seemingly through psychic or warp-based means. It is reasonable to assume the Emperor possessed the same ability, which means the one-way ship was not a necessity. It was a choice. Perhaps it was even a performance, a piece of theatre designed to create a specific narrative for anyone who might later investigate what had happened. Consider also that the Emperor, upon leaving Molech, has left Olivia Soreka behind to guard the gate. He tasked her with watching over the portal and preventing anyone else from using it, a duty she would carry out faithfully for thousands of years. If the Emperor had simply taken what he wanted and escaped, if the gate was merely a tool he had used and discarded, why would he leave a guardian? Why not destroy the gate entirely?
And honestly, this is one of the reasons I keep going back to the setting, because Molech is not just some cool lore for the sake of cool lore. It asks us real questions, and I think about that probably way too much. But if you had the power to save everyone you loved, but the only way to get that power was to walk into the worst place imaginable and make a deal you knew would haunt you forever, would you do it? I think most of us would say yes without hesitation, and that is exactly what makes the Imperium such a fascinating character to me. He's not a clean hero, he's not a villain, he's just a guy who looked at an impossible situation and chose the option that hurt the least, even though it still hurt more than most of us can imagine. And I think that is way more interesting than any golden god on a throne. That is a person making a choice, and choices, good or bad, are what makes stories worth telling. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
The fact that he left it intact, guarded but accessible, suggests that he intended it to be used again. Perhaps not by himself. Perhaps by someone else. Perhaps by a specific someone at a specific time, for a specific reason that the Emperor had already foreseen. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us return to the moment. The Emperor stepped back through the gate, back into the material universe, back onto the soil of Molech. And when he emerged, he was changed. Not visibly, perhaps, not in any way that the casual observer would have noticed, but changed nonetheless. He carried within him knowledge that no other human being possessed, knowledge of how to manipulate the raw stuff of the warp, knowledge of how to create beings that were more than human, more than mortal, more than anything the galaxy had ever seen. Knowledge that would allow him to build the instruments of his grandest ambition, the primarchs, and through them, the Space Marine legions, and through them, the Imperium of mankind itself. He left Olivia Sorica on Molech with her duty and her instructions. He departed the planet, returning to Terra through means that remain unclear. And he began the next phase of his plan, the phase that would consume the next several thousand years of human history and ultimately reshape the galaxy itself, the Primarch Project. Back on Terra, the Emperor set to work, and we need to appreciate the scale of what he was attempting, because nothing like it had ever been tried before, and nothing like it has been accomplished since. He was not simply engineering a new type of soldier, he was creating demigods, beings who would stand between humanity and extinction, who would possess the strategic brilliance of the greatest military minds in history, the physical prowess of the mightiest warriors who had ever lived, and then the charismatic presence of leaders whose words could move armies to tears and inspire civilizations to greatness. 20 of them, each one unique, each one designed to embody a different facet of the qualities humanity would need to survive. One for strategy, one for endurance, one for speed, one for stealth, one for justice, one for mercy, one for wrath. 20 different expressions of the same fundamental purpose. 20 variations on the theme of human potential pushed beyond every conceivable limit. The laboratory was constructed deep beneath what would eventually become the Imperial Palace, in the gene vaults hidden under the Himalayan mountains. The facility was vast, sprawling through tunnels and chambers that had been carved from the living rock, with technology so advanced that modern mechanicum adepts would weep to see it. Within these chambers, surrounded by equipment that drew upon the most sophisticated genetic science the Dark Age of technology had ever produced, the Emperor began the work that the knowledge from Molech had made possible. He had the knowledge he needed. He had the power he needed. And he had a very specific vision of what he intended to create. 20 superhuman beings, 20 primarchs, each one forged from the Emperor's own genetic material, each one imbued with aspects of his soul. Is each one designed to embody a different facet of the qualities that humanity would need to survive and thrive in a hostile universe. They would be his generals, his sons, his greatest weapons, and his most profound legacy. They would lead humanity to the stars and build an empire that would endure until the end of time. The process required more than science. The Emperor drew upon the arcane lore and forbidden knowledge he had brought back from the realm of chaos. As the Aeldari seer Eldrad Ulthran would later attest, the Emperor utilized dark powers in the construction of the primarchs. He was working with forces that no human had ever harnessed before, weaving warp energy into the genetic structure of living beings with a precision and a delicacy that would have been impossible without the specific knowledge he had gained on Molech. Each primarch was, in a very real sense, a masterpiece of both science and sorcery. At the greatest achievement of human genetic engineering, elevated beyond the merely biological by the infusion of immaterial power. But the primarchs were not created through science alone. The Emperor also drew upon the powers of the warp that he had learned on Molech, using immaterial energies to enhance his creations far beyond what genetic engineering could achieve. This is a crucial detail, and it is one that many people overlook. The primarchs were not simply very good clones of the Emperor. They were beings whose very souls had been touched by the warp, imbued with a psychic resonance that gave them their extraordinary charisma, their superhuman capabilities, and their almost magnetic ability to inspire loyalty and devotion in those around them. They were, in the truest sense, children of both the material universe and the Imperium, creatures of science and sorcery, flesh and warp energy, are blended together in a way that had never been attempted before and has never been replicated since. The Emperor did not work alone. He was assisted by Erda, a fellow perpetual and a master geneticist whose skills were essential to the success of the project. Erda served as the female genetic donor to the primarchs, combining her own genetic material with the Emperor's to create the foundation from which all 20 would grow. She was, in every biological sense that matters, their mother. The Emperor was their father. And between them, using the forbidden knowledge gained on Molech, they brought into existence the most powerful beings humanity had ever produced. But Erda was not merely a willing participant. She was a woman with her own beliefs, her own moral compass, and her own growing horror at what the Emperor intended to do with the beings they had created together. Because the Emperor had no intention of raising the primarchs as children. He had no interest in letting them grow and develop naturally, in letting them find their own paths and make their own choices. They were tools, instruments of conquest, weapons designed for a very specific purpose, and the Emperor intended to use them exactly as he had designed them, without sentiment, without hesitation, and without mercy. Erda saw this, and it broke her heart. The tension between Erda and the Emperor was not merely a disagreement about parenting philosophy. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews between two immortal beings who had known each other for thousands of years. Erda believed that the primarchs deserved the chance to grow and develop as individuals, to find their own paths and make their own choices, even if those choices led them away from the Emperor's grand design. She saw them not as tools or weapons, but as children, beings with their own inherent worth and dignity, beings who deserved better than to be shaped and molded and deployed like pieces on a cosmic chessboard. The Emperor saw things differently. To him, the primarchs were not children in the sentimental sense. They were the answer to a question that had haunted him for 10,000 years. How do you save a species that is too numerous to protect, too scattered to unite, and too vulnerable to the darkness of the warp to survive on its own? The answer was the primarchs. And the answer required that they be used. Not cruelly, not carelessly, but deliberately, with the kind of cold, strategic precision that a being who had watched civilizations rise and fall for millennia understood was necessary. Sentiment was a luxury the species could not afford. Not now, not with what was coming. Erda could not accept this. And her refusal to accept it led her to make a decision that would echo through the next 10,000 years of human history, with consequences so devastating that even the chaos gods were surprised. The specifics of what happened next are a matter of some debate within the lore. According to Erda herself, speaking in the novel Saturnine by Dan Abnett, She was the one who scattered the primarchs. Horrified by the future the Emperor had planned for them, as she created a warp vortex that tore the infant primarchs from their gestation chambers beneath the Himalayan mountains and hurled them across the galaxy, sending each one to a different world, far beyond the Emperor's reach. According to other sources, including the novel The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, it was the Chaos Gods who scattered the primarchs, reaching through the warp to steal the Emperor's children and deposit them on worlds of their choosing, worlds that would shape them, test them, and in some cases, break them. Word-bearers. Chaplain Argel Tal was even shown a vision of this event, traveling back through time to witness the moment the primarchs were torn from their father's laboratory. The truth, as with so many things in the lore of Warhammer 40k, likely lies somewhere in the messy middle ground between these accounts. Perhaps Erda weakened the protections around the primarchs, and the Chaos Gods exploited that weakness to scatter them. As perhaps Erda acted on her own initiative, but the Chaos Gods manipulated her into doing so without her knowledge. Perhaps both forces worked in concert, each pursuing their own goals, each unaware of the full scope of the other's involvement. The novel Warhawk by Chris Raitt has Erebus himself suggesting that even the Chaos Gods were not entirely sure why Erda did what she did, only that they were grateful for the opportunity it provided. Whatever the mechanism, the result was catastrophic. The 20 primarchs were scattered across the galaxy, landing on worlds that ranged from paradise to nightmare. Some, like Rabute Gilliman, landed on worlds where they were raised with care and grew into wise and capable leaders. Others, like Angron and Conrad Kurz, landed on worlds of such unimaginable cruelty that the experience warped them into something the Emperor had never intended them to be. Each primarch was shaped by the world that raised him, for better or for worse. And because each primarch had been imbued with warp energy on Molech, because their very souls were tinged with the power of the Imperium, they were uniquely vulnerable to the influence of chaos. Their bright, burning souls were beacons in the warp, drawing the attention of demons and dark gods like moths to a flame. This was the first consequence of Molech, the first ripple in the pond. The Emperor had gained the knowledge to create the primarchs, but in doing so, he had inadvertently made them susceptible to the very powers he intended them to fight. The deal he may or may not have struck with the Chaos Gods, the power he had drawn from the warp to enhance his sons, it was all coming back to haunt him. The seeds of the Horus heresy were planted not on Istvan or Davin or any of the other worlds that would become synonymous with betrayal. They were planted on Molech. In the moment the Emperor chose to walk through that gate and treat with the darkness. Whilst the Emperor was devastated by the loss of his sons, though he did not show it in any way that those around him could easily recognize. He was not a man who displayed grief or frustration or despair. He was a being of purpose, of plan, of relentless forward momentum. And so, rather than mourning what had been lost, he adapted. He used the genetic material he had already collected from the primarchs before their scattering to create the Space Marine legions. About 20 armies of genetically enhanced super soldiers, each one tied to a specific primarch through shared gene seed. These legions would serve as the fighting force of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's grand campaign to reunite the scattered worlds of humanity under a single government. And as the crusade pushed outward into the galaxy, the Emperor found his lost sons one by one, reuniting each primarch with the legion that carried his genetic legacy. But through all of this, through the unification wars on Terra, through the creation of the Space Marines, through the launch of the Great Crusade, and the discovery of each lost primarch, Molech remained, the gate remained, the secret remained. And the Emperor knew that, sooner or later, someone would come looking for what he had found there. That is why, in 869 of the 30th millennium, at the height of the Great Crusade, the Emperor returned to Molech. And this time, he did not come alone. He came with 4 of his primarch sons, Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels, Jagatai Khan of the White Scars, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, and Horus Lupercal of the lunar wolves, the favored son, the firstborn, the brightest star in the Emperor's constellation. Now, pause here and think about the choice of primarchs the Emperor brought to Molech, because these were not random selections. Nothing the Emperor did was random. He brought the lion as a being of absolute loyalty and strategic brilliance, but also a being of deep secrecy and dark complexity, a primarch who understood the necessity of keeping things hidden. He brought the Khan, a warrior of unmatched speed and independence, a primarch who valued freedom above all things and who would chafe under any restriction that he perceived as unjust. He brought Fulgrim, the perfectionist, the artist, as the primarch whose pursuit of excellence would eventually twist into a pursuit of sensation that delivered him into the arms of Slaanesh. And he brought Horus, his favorite, his first, the son he loved above all others, and trusted with the leadership of the greatest military campaign in human history. Why these four? Why not Robut Guilliman, the administrator, the empire builder? Why not Rogel Dawn, the fortifier, the defender? Why not Sanguinius, the angel, whose loyalty and nobility were beyond question? The answer may lie in the nature of the trap that many believe the Emperor was already preparing. If Molech was designed to attract a future traitor, then bringing primarchs who were already vulnerable to the influence of chaos, primarchs whose personalities contained the seeds of the very flaws that chaos would later exploit, was not a mistake. It was the first move in a game that would not be completed for another 10,000 years. Or perhaps the answer is simpler. Perhaps the Emperor brought these four because they were available, because their legions were operating in the region, because the logistics of the Great Crusade demanded that certain primarchs be in certain places at certain times. Not everything in the lore needs to be a conspiracy. Sometimes proximity explains what hidden purpose cannot. But it is worth noting that the Emperor's decision to erase the memories of all four primarchs suggests that he was deeply concerned about the information they might have absorbed during their time on Molech. If the visit had been purely routine, if the compliance had been nothing more than another world added to the growing roster of the Imperium, there would have been no need for memory wipes. But the very act of erasing their recollections was an admission that Molech contained something dangerous, something that the Emperor did not want his sons to know about, something that could be used against him if it fell into the wrong hands. The compliance of Molech was peaceful. The people of the planet had long awaited a return to the Terran fold, and there was no resistance. The Emperor and his sons descended upon the world with overwhelming force, not because force was needed, but because the Emperor wanted to make absolutely certain that Molech was properly secured. He spent 111 days on the planet, personally overseeing the fortification of the world, establishing garrisons, placing defenses, and ensuring that the warpgate beneath Lupercalia was protected by layers upon layers of military and psychic security. He left behind a staggering garrison. Elements of multiple Space Marine legions, Titan legions, night houses, over 100 regiments of the Imperial Army, millions upon millions of soldiers dedicated to the defense of a world that, to all outward appearances, had no strategic value whatsoever. To anyone observing from the outside, the Emperor's investment in Molech made no sense. Why pour so many resources into defending a quiet night world that had offered no resistance and posed no threat? The answer, of course, was hidden underground. The gate. The Emperor was not defending Molech. He was defending the gate. He was ensuring that nobody, no enemy, no traitor, no ambitious fool with more courage than sense could ever reach the portal and use it the way he had. And then he did something extraordinary, something that, in retrospect, raises more questions than it answers. He erased the memory of Molech from the minds of every single person who had accompanied him there. Not just the soldiers, not just the officers, the primarchs themselves. Lion L. Johnson, Jagatai Khan, Fulgrim, and Horus, four of the most powerful minds in the galaxy, four beings whose psychic resilience should have made them proof against any form of mental manipulation, The Emperor reached into their heads and simply deleted their memories of Molech. He removed any knowledge of the planet's significance, any recollection of why they had been there, any hint that the world they had just conquered contained anything worth remembering. Why? Why erase their memories? Or if the Emperor trusted his sons, if he believed they were loyal and incorruptible, why not simply tell them the truth? Why not explain that Molech contained a warpgate, that it needed to be protected, and that they must never allow anyone to access it? The answer, uncomfortable as it is that the Emperor did not trust his sons. Not completely, not absolutely. He had created them with warp energy. He knew they were vulnerable to chaos corruption. He had already lost them once. Well, when they were scattered across the galaxy, and he had seen the damage that exposure to hostile worlds had done to some of them, he could not be certain, could never be certain, that one of them would not eventually fall. And if one of them fell, if one of his sons succumbed to the whispers of the dark gods, the last thing he wanted was for that fallen son to know about Molech. So he hid it. He buried the secret beneath layers of psychic suppression and military force and bureaucratic obscurity. And he made Molech invisible, a world that nobody thought about, that nobody questioned, that nobody had any reason to investigate. A world whose very name was designed to evoke nothing, to inspire no curiosity, to attract no attention. It was a masterful act of concealment. But it was also, perhaps, the Emperor's greatest mistake. Because the thing about erased memories is that they leave traces, gaps, holes in the fabric of a mind that a sufficiently motivated searcher can detect and exploit. And Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's most beloved son, the warmaster of the Great Crusade, the brightest and most ambitious of all the primarchs, was nothing if not sufficiently motivated. The path from Molech's peaceful compliance during the Great Crusade to the devastating battle that would engulf the planet during the Horus heresy is a path paved with buried secrets and recovered memories. And it begins, as so many terrible things do, with a question. A small, nagging, seemingly insignificant question that wormed its way into the back of Horus Lupercal's mind and refused to be silenced. Something was missing. He could feel it. There were gaps in his memory, holes where recollections should have been, blank spaces in the otherwise perfect architecture of a primarch's mind. This was wrong. Primarchs did not forget things. Their brains were engineered to be perfect recording devices, incapable of absorbing and retaining vast quantities of information with flawless precision. For a primarch to have gaps in his memory was not merely unusual, it was impossible. Unless someone had deliberately put those gaps there, the discovery gnawed at him like a wound that would not heal. Horus was, even before his fall to chaos, a being of immense pride and fierce intelligence. He was the War Master, the first found, the Emperor's favorite son. That the primarch who had been trusted with the greatest responsibility any being had ever been given, the leadership of the Great Crusade to reunite humanity. For such a being to discover that his own father had reached into his mind and stolen memories from him, that was not merely an insult. It was a violation. It suggested that the Emperor did not trust him. It implied that there were secrets so dark, so dangerous, and so fundamentally destabilizing that even the War Master of the Imperium could not be allowed to know them. For a man who was already wrestling with feelings of abandonment and betrayal, who was already questioning why the Emperor had retreated to Terra and left him to carry the burden of the Crusade alone, who was already being fed poison by the whispers of chaos and the manipulations of corrupt chaplains and ambitious sorcerers. The discovery of those memory gaps was like throwing fuel on a fire that was already burning out of control. The realization came slowly, building like a storm on a distant horizon. Horus had been to Molech. He knew this. He had fragments, wisps of recollection, half-remembered images of a green world beneath an unfamiliar sky. But the details were gone. The why was gone. The purpose of the visit, the significance of the world, everything that mattered had been surgically removed from his consciousness, leaving behind only the nagging awareness that something important had been stolen from him. After his fall to chaos, After the corruption that began on Davin and deepened with every passing day, Horus became obsessed with recovering what had been taken from him. He assaulted the world of Dwell specifically to gather information about his own past, and what he found there confirmed his suspicions. He had been to Molech, but not just him, but also Fulgrim and Jagatai Khan and the Lion. They had gone there with the Emperor himself, and the Emperor had tampered with their memories afterward. The question was, why? The answer came from the darkest possible source. Through communion with the powers of the warp, through the whispered secrets of demons and the recovered fragments of his erased memories, Horus pieced together the truth. Or rather, he pieced together a version of the truth, like the version that the Chaos Gods wanted him to believe. According to this version, Molech was where the Emperor had gained his godlike power. It was where he had entered the warp and struck a bargain with the Chaos Gods, gaining the knowledge and ability to create the primarchs and the Space Marines. It was where the foundation of the entire Imperium had been laid, not through human genius or divine right, but through a deal with the very forces of corruption and damnation that the Emperor claimed to oppose. For Horus, this revelation was devastating. It meant that everything the Emperor had told him was a lie. The imperial truth, the secular philosophy that denied the existence of gods and demons, was a fabrication designed to hide the Emperor's own dealings with those very entities. The Emperor's power was not earned through merit or destiny. It was stolen, borrowed, extracted from the Chaos Gods through deception and broken promises. And the primarchs themselves, the Emperor's beloved sons, were products of that theft, created using knowledge that the Emperor had no right to possess, imbued with warp energy that came with strings attached, strings that the Emperor had simply cut and walked away from, leaving his sons to pay the price. Whether this version of events is accurate is, as we have discussed, highly debatable. The Chaos Gods are not reliable narrators. They had every reason to tell Horus a story that would fuel his rage and drive him toward open rebellion. But for Horus, the truth of the story mattered less than its emotional impact. He felt betrayed. He felt used. He felt that his entire existence, his purpose, his identity, everything that made him who he was, had been built on a foundation of lies. And he decided that if the Emperor could gain power from the warp, then so could he. Horus set course for Molech. He assembled a massive invasion force, the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, led by the grim and implacable Mortarion, multiple Titan legions, hundreds of thousands of mortal soldiers, demonic allies summoned from the depths of the warp. This was not a surgical strike or a precision operation. This was a full-scale planetary invasion, and a hammer blow designed to smash through Molech's formidable defenses and deliver Horus to the gate that his father had used so many thousands of years before. The defenders of Molech were formidable. The Emperor had left behind a garrison specifically designed to prevent exactly this scenario. 3 Titan legions stood ready, the Legio Griffonicus, the Legio Crucius, and the Legio Fortidus, their towering war engines arrayed across the planet's surface like mountains of steel. As nearly a dozen night houses, including the powerful House Divine, House Tazkar, and several others, manned their mechanical steeds and prepared for battle. Over 100 regiments of the Imperial Army, along with elements of the Blood Angels and Ultramarines legions, added their strength to the defensive line. In total, over 58 million soldiers stood ready to defend Molech. The traitor force was equally massive. 4 Titan legions marched under Horus's banner: the Legio Vulpa, the Legio Interfecta, the Legio Vulcanum, and the infamous Legio Mortis, Death's Heads, whose sinister reputation preceded them like a plague. The Sons of Horus landed in force, their warmaster personally leading the assault with a fervor that spoke of desperation as much as determination. Mortarion and the Death Guard brought their own particular brand of horror to the conflict, their corroded armor and toxic weapons turning every battlefield into a charnel house. And Horus's assault was devastating from the first moment. He captured Molech's orbital defense platforms and turned their weapons on the loyalist fleet, smashing aside the defending battleships with their own guns. He launched a full-scale orbital bombardment that leveled cities and annihilated fortresses, the kind of scorched earth approach that left no room for negotiation or retreat. He landed on the island of Damasek, the very spot where the emperor had first arrived on Molech thousands of years before, and began retracing his father's steps, working his way backward from the emperor's point of departure toward the location of the warpgate. The fighting was brutal beyond description. Millions died in the opening days alone. Titan fought Titan across burning landscapes, their massive weapons tearing holes in the earth and setting the very air on fire. Night houses clashed in the jungles and the plains, their mechanical steeds trading blows that could level buildings. Imperial army regiments fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were defending something far more important than a piece of ground, even if they did not know exactly what that something was. The scale of the violence on Molech is difficult to convey in words. Imagine a world roughly the size of Earth, its entire surface transformed into a battlefield. Imagine oceans boiling from the heat of orbital bombardment, tsunamis crashing against coastal defenses, debris from destroyed warships falling from orbit like burning rain. Imagine the ground itself shaking as god machines strode across it, their footfalls registering as earthquakes, their weapons painting the horizon with fire. Imagine the sound, the unending, ear-splitting, soul-crushing roar of weapons that could level cities discharging simultaneously across an entire continent. Imagine the smell of ozone and blood and burning metal and the sickly sweet stench of chemical weapons and the indescribable wrongness that came from the presence of demonic entities manifesting on the material plane. The traitor advance was methodical and merciless. The Death Guard, led by the implacable Mortarion, advanced across Molech's surface like a living plague. Where they walked, the very ground sickened, crops withered, water turned foul. The air itself became toxic, thick with pathogens and poisons that killed ordinary humans within hours and left even enhanced warriors gasping and retching. Mortarion had always been a master of attrition warfare, a general who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon was not a bolt round or a power sword, but simple, grinding, inexorable pressure. On Molech, he proved that understanding with devastating efficiency. The demonically resurrected Ignatius Grulgor was unleashed upon the planet as a walking biological catastrophe, carrying the life-eater virus within his corrupted form. He destroyed thousands of kilometers of previously impassable forest, the dense jungle that had been one of Molech's defining features reduced to a dead, grey wasteland in a matter of hours. The beasts that fled before Grulgor's advance crashed into the Loyalist defensive lines, their terrified stampede providing cover for traitor forces to advance behind them. It was a tactic that combined biological warfare with psychological terror, an approach that was uniquely suited to the Death Guard's grim methodology. Meanwhile, the sons of Horus fought with the ferocity of warriors who knew their warmaster was watching. The Justaran Terminators, Horus's elite bodyguard, carved through Loyalist positions with a precision and a savagery that left hardened veterans of 100 campaigns stunned. Abaddon, the first captain, led assault after assault against the strongest points in the Imperial defense, his lightning claws tearing through armor and flesh with equal contempt. The Mournival, what remained of it, coordinated the traitor advance with the cold efficiency of officers who had been trained by the greatest military mind in the galaxy and had chosen to turn that training against their father's empire. And then came the betrayal, the moment that broke the back of Molech's defense and sealed the planet's fate. But House Divine, the ruling night house of Molech, the family whose fortress had been built around the very spacecraft the Emperor had arrived in, turned traitor. They had been corrupted by the dark influence of Slanesh, the chaos god of pleasure and excess, whose serpent cult had wormed its way into the heart of the noble family through generations of secret worship and hidden ritual. The corruption had deep roots. Long before the Imperium came to Molech, as before the Emperor returned during the Great Crusade, and banned the worship of the old serpent gods in favor of the imperial truth. The people of Divine had worshipped beings they called the serpent gods. When the Imperium arrived and outlawed these practices, the worship did not end. It simply went underground. Secret cabals continued their depraved rites and ceremonies, practicing their forbidden religion in hidden chambers and darkened halls, while passing their devotion from parent to child through whispered oaths and blood-sealed pacts. The serpent cult was not some fringe movement or minor heresy. It was embedded in the very DNA of House Divine, woven into the family's identity as deeply as their knight traditions and their noble bloodlines. The cult had existed for centuries before the Imperium arrived, and no amount of imperial truth could eradicate something that ancient and that personal. The people of House Divine smiled and nodded and repeated the words of secular enlightenment that the iterators spoke, and then they went home and prayed to the serpent in the dark. This is one of the great ironies of the imperial truth. The emperor's secular philosophy, which denied the existence of gods and the supernatural, was designed to starve the chaos gods of worship and belief. But by denying the existence of the very powers that were actively trying to corrupt humanity, the imperial truth also denied humanity the knowledge it needed to recognize and resist that corruption. The people of House Divine did not know that their serpent gods were manifestations of Slanesh. They did not know that their secret rituals were feeding the Prince of Pleasure, strengthening its hold on their souls, gradually transforming their harmless tradition into a weapon of chaos. They were ignorant, and their ignorance was the direct result of the Emperor's own policy. The last true ruler of House Divine, Cyprian Divine, was largely ignorant of the corruption festering within his own household. His wife, his children, his closest advisors, many of them were part of the serpent cult, devotees of Slanesh, who served the dark god with a fervor that matched their outward display of imperial loyalty. The political intrigues within House Divine were as tangled and as poisonous as any in the history of human nobility. Lady Sibella, Cyprian's wife, was a schemer of exceptional ability, manipulating her children and her husband with a deftness that would have earned the admiration of any chaos god. Her daughter Lix, who served as the adoratrice, a priestess with limited powers of divination, was part of the serpent cult as well, her visions guided by entities that she did not fully understand. Cyprian was murdered by his own son, Raven, who seized power and began steering the house toward its ultimate betrayal. Raven himself was a complex figure, a skilled knight pilot and a charismatic leader who was not entirely corrupted by the serpent cult, but who was surrounded by corruption on every side, and who lacked the wisdom or the awareness to recognize it for what it was. His half-brother Albard, crippled and resentful, was far more deeply ensnared, and it was through Albard that the final corruption would come. But even Raven was merely a pawn in a larger game. When the battle for Molech began, when the pressure of constant warfare and the insidious whispers of chaos began to wear down the defender's resolve, the corruption within House Divine blossomed like a poisoned flower. The months of fighting took their toll in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. The constant proximity to chaos forces, the daily exposure to the reality-warping effects of demonic manifestation, the psychological pressure of fighting an enemy that included corrupted space marines who had once been the Imperium's greatest champions, all of it eroded the defender's spiritual resistance. The Knights of House Divine, already compromised by generations of serpent worship, began to slip. Their officers became lethargic, disinterested in the war effort, consumed by private pleasures that grew stranger and more extreme with each passing week. Or they began hunting the wild animals of Molech with their knight suits, not for food or sport, but for the sheer visceral thrill of the kill, the sensation of power and dominance that the act provided. They met in secret cabals at night, performing rituals that had been passed down through generations of hidden worship, rituals that were now charged with a terrible new potency by the proximity of the chaos forces and the weakening of the veil between reality and the warp. Albard Divine, but Raven's crippled elder half-brother, became the vessel through which Slaanesh's influence was most powerfully expressed. Driven mad by visions of a great serpent, transformed by the demonic power that flowed through him, Albard rallied the corrupted members of House Divine and turned their weapons on their own allies. The demon primarch Fulgrim, now a twisted servant of Slaanesh, used his powers to complete the corruption that had been building for decades, as ensnaring Albard and his followers in a web of obsession and madness that left them utterly devoted to the Prince of Pleasure. The betrayal came at the worst possible moment. The Loyalist forces were already hard-pressed, fighting desperately to hold their lines against the relentless advance of Horus's armies. When House Divine turned, when the knights that had been standing shoulder to shoulder with the defenders suddenly swiveled their weapons and opened fire on their former allies, the Loyalist position collapsed. Caught between the traitor forces advancing from the front and the renegade knights attacking from behind, the Imperial defenders were slaughtered without mercy. The massacre was almost total. Of the entire Imperial host, the millions of soldiers who had been stationed on Molech to defend the Emperor's secret, only 1 in 100 survived. The rest died on the fields, and in the jungles of a world whose true significance most of them never knew. Or they died defending a gate they had never seen, fighting for a secret they had never been told, sacrificing their lives for a cause whose full scope they could not even begin to imagine. The refugee ship Molech's Enlightenment carried the survivors away from the dying planet, a handful of broken soldiers and terrified civilians, fleeing the wreckage of a world that had been torn apart by forces beyond their comprehension. Horus deliberately let the ship go. Had he wanted the survivors to spread word of what had happened on Molech? He wanted the rest of the Imperium to know the terror that was coming. And then Horus went to the gate. He fought his way through the cave systems beneath Lupercalia, leading his Justaeran Terminators and the Mournival through tunnels that the Emperor had walked 10,000 years before. Along the way, he encountered a psychic guardian, a trap left behind by the Emperor himself, and a being of blinding light and terrible power that took the form of an angel of fire and attacked Horus and his companions with devastating force. The Guardian slaughtered the Justaeran, wounded Abaddon and the other members of the Mournival, and nearly destroyed Horus himself. But the War Master shattered the Guardian with his great mace, Worldbreaker, the very weapon that had been forged for him by the Emperor's own artificers. And in that moment of destruction, as the psychic trap disintegrated, the memory blocks that the Emperor had placed on Horus's mind shattered as well. He remembered everything. He remembered Molech. He remembered the gate. He remembered what his father had done. Olivia Soreka was waiting at the gate. She had been waiting for 10,000 years, faithful to her duty, in carrying out the mission the Emperor had given her with the patient dedication of an immortal who understood that some tasks are measured not in days or years, but in millennia. Think about that for a moment. 10,000 years. Standing guard over a portal to hell in the caves beneath a planet that slowly grew and changed around her while she remained the same. She had watched the night houses rise to power. She had watched the Emperor return during the Great Crusade, fortifying the planet with such overwhelming force that her role as guardian had become redundant. She had watched the great city of Lupercalia grow over the very cave network she guarded, its streets and buildings and homes constructed by people who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. She had settled down, adopted a family, built something approaching a normal life in the shadow of her eternal duty. And now that duty had come due. Horus was here. The son of the man she had served for millennia was standing at the gates of the very secret she had been entrusted to protect, and she was going to stop him or die trying. Olivia Soreka was a formidable being in her own right. She was a powerful psyker, a perpetual of considerable age and experience, and she possessed a determination that was every bit as unyielding as the Emperor's own. She recruited a small band of ultramarines to help her seal the gate, and they fought desperately to hold off the sons of Horus and the Death Guard, as Olivia began the ritual that would close the portal forever. The ritual itself was a staggering display of psychic power. Olivia poured everything she had into the ancient mechanism of the gate, her will pushing against forces that had existed since before the stars were born. The gate began to respond, its energies diminishing, its connection to the realm of chaos weakening moment by moment. She was doing what the Emperor had asked her to do. She was closing the door, shutting off the path to the warp, denying Horus the prize that he had fought across an entire world to reach. She almost succeeded. She was close, so close, her psychic power pouring into the ancient mechanism, the gate beginning to shrink and darken. But Horus was faster. He reached the chamber. He killed the Ultramarines, and he drove his power claw through Olivia Soreka's body, impaling the Perpetual who had guarded his father's secret for 10,000 years. She died with the ritual incomplete, the gate still open, the path to the realm of chaos still accessible. Horus shattered the gate's stone monument with Worldbreaker and stepped through into the warp. Moments passed. In the real world, only seconds ticked by. The blood on Mortarian's scythe had not even dried. But in the warp, time moves differently. For Horus, the journey lasted years. He walked the obsidian paths that led to the citadels of the Chaos Gods. He fought alongside demon armies. He campaigned across the impossible landscapes of the Imperium, proving himself worthy of the power he sought. He was guided by the entity known as the Red Angel, a name loaded with significance and mystery. The experience was transformative in ways that went beyond the mere acquisition of power. In the warp, Horus confronted the full scope of what the Chaos Gods truly were. He saw their kingdoms, their endless legions, the sheer magnitude of the forces that existed on the other side of the veil. He fought in their wars, led their armies, proved his worth through acts of violence and cunning that would have been impossible in the material universe. Every battle he won earned him another portion of their favor. Every enemy he defeated opened another door in the labyrinth of the Imperium. He was being tested, measured, evaluated by intelligences that were older than the stars, and with each test he passed, the power flowing into him increased. But the power came with chains, invisible, intangible, but utterly unbreakable chains that bound him to the will of the Chaos Gods in ways he either did not understand or chose to ignore. Every gift of power was also a hook, sinking deeper into his soul, attaching itself to his ambition and his pride and his rage and his desire for recognition. The Chaos Gods were not giving Horus power out of generosity. They were investing in him. They were creating a weapon, a vessel, a champion who would carry their influence into the material universe and use it to tear down the one being they truly feared. The Emperor, the anathema, the man who had walked through this same gate 10,000 years before and stolen from them without paying the price. Horus emerged convinced that he was empowered. What he did not understand, but what he could not afford to understand, was that he was also enslaved. The power he carried was eating him alive. It was burning through his primarch physiology with an intensity that his body, for all its superhuman resilience, could not sustain indefinitely. The Chaos Gods had given him the strength to challenge the Emperor, but they had also given him a ticking clock, a countdown, a deadline that could not be extended, could not be negotiated, could not be avoided. He had to reach Terra. He had to kill his father. He had to do it before the power consuming him from the inside out reduced him to nothing. And at the end of his journey, he received what he had come for, the power of the Chaos Gods. The same power, or something like it, that his father had claimed so many millennia ago. When Horus stepped back through the gate, he was visibly changed. He had aged. His face bore the marks of years that had passed in the warp, but not in real space. His presence was heavier, darker, as charged with a power that made even his own sons take a step back in something that was not quite fear, but was certainly not comfort. He claimed to have gotten exactly what he wanted. He declared himself empowered, elevated, ascended to a level that rivaled the Emperor himself. The transformation was not merely spiritual or metaphysical, it was physical. Horus looked different, older, weathered, As if the years he had spent in the warp, years that in real space had lasted only moments, had left their mark on his transhuman flesh. His eyes held a depth and a darkness that they had not possessed before, a knowledge of things that no mortal mind was meant to contain. His voice carried new harmonics, new resonances, as if the words he spoke were being echoed by voices that existed in a dimension beyond human perception. He radiated power the way a furnace radiates heat, and those who stood near him could feel it pressing against their skin like a physical force, but warm and oppressive and faintly terrifying. The sons of Horus rejoiced. Their war master had returned to them, ascended, elevated, transformed into something that could genuinely challenge the master of mankind. The other traitor primarchs, those who had thrown in their lot with Horus, regarded the transformation with a mixture of awe and unease. Mortarion, who despised sorcery even as he served the god of plague, saw what Horus had become and felt a cold knot of recognition in whatever remained of his soul. This was what the future looked like for all of them. Not just soldiers in a rebellion, but vessels for power that came from somewhere else, power that was given by entities that always demanded something in return. But Horus himself seemed untroubled by such concerns. He had gotten what he came for. He had the power, he had the knowledge, he had the raw, unbridled force of all four chaos gods flowing through him. And he believed, with the absolute conviction of a primarch whose confidence had always been his greatest strength, that he could wield that power without being consumed by it. He believed he was the master, not the servant. He believed he was using the chaos gods, not the other way around. He was wrong. But he would not discover how wrong until it was far too late. But here is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. Because there is a school of thought among those who study the law that suggests Molech was not a secret the emperor failed to keep. It was a trap. A carefully constructed, elaborately maintained, millennia-spanning trap, designed specifically to lure a traitorous primarch into the warp and thereby seal his fate. Consider the evidence. The emperor brought 4 primarchs to Molech during the Great Crusade. 4 sons who would eventually be touched by chaos in one way or another. Yet he erased their memories, but imperfectly. He left traces, gaps, holes that a determined mind could detect and exploit. He left the gate intact and guarded, rather than destroying it, even though destruction would have been far simpler and far safer. He left behind a garrison that, while formidable, was not insurmountable. He even allowed the serpent cult of Slanesh to persist on Molech, an occult that would eventually corrupt House Divine and provide the traitors with their most critical advantage during the battle. Every one of these decisions seems, on the surface, like a failure, a mistake, an oversight by a being whose brilliance was supposed to be beyond human comprehension. But what if they were not mistakes at all? What if the emperor wanted a traitorous son to come to Molech? What if he wanted that son to pass through the gate and claim the power of chaos? Because once Horus stepped through the gate and accepted the power of the chaos gods, he was on a timer. The warp energy that now fueled his existence was immense but unstable. It was eating him alive. With every passing day, the power he had gained was consuming him, burning through his mortal form, accelerating his death. Horus could feel it. He knew that his time was limited, and this knowledge forced his hand in a way that nothing else could have. Before Molech, Horus had options. He could have consolidated his gains, building a splinter empire in the territories he had already conquered. He could have turned on Ultramar and destroyed Rabut Gilliman's power base, eliminating the greatest threat to his rear. He could have waged a war of attrition, slowly bleeding the Imperium dry over decades or centuries, using his military genius to chip away at the Emperor's strength until victory was assured. All of these strategies were available to him, or all of them would have been devastatingly effective. After Molech, none of them were possible. Horus was dying. His body was failing. The power of chaos was consuming him from the inside out. He had no time for patient strategies or long-term campaigns. He had to reach Terra. He had to confront his father. He had to do it now, immediately, as fast as he possibly could, before the very power that made him strong enough to challenge the Emperor burned him to ashes. In other words, by accepting the power of the Chaos Gods, Horus had handed the Emperor control of the entire war. The Emperor now knew exactly what Horus would do, exactly where he would go, exactly when he would arrive. Horus had become predictable. His path was fixed. His actions were predetermined. From the moment he stepped through the gate on Molech, every decision Horus made was the decision the Emperor had foreseen and planned for, if this interpretation is correct. But then Molech was not just the most important battle of the Horus heresy. It was the battle that decided the war. Not because the loyalists won, they did not, but because the traitor's victory was itself the mechanism of his defeat. Horus won the battle of Molech. He gained the power he sought. He achieved his apotheosis, and in doing so, he walked directly into the most brilliant, most patient, yet most devastatingly effective trap that had ever been conceived by any mind in the history of the galaxy. The Emperor, the being who had walked into the realm of chaos 10,000 years before and emerged with the knowledge to create demigods, had done it again. He had played a game that spanned millennia, using his own secrets as bait, his own sons as pieces on the board, and his own apparent failures as the mechanism of his ultimate victory. Molech was not the place where the Emperor's plans began to unravel. Molech was where the Emperor's plans came together. Of course, this interpretation raises its own uncomfortable questions. If the Emperor planned for a sun to fall, if he deliberately left the gate accessible as bait for a traitor, then he knew that millions of innocent soldiers would die defending Molech. He knew that House Divine would fall to corruption. He knew that Olivia Soreka, the woman who had guarded his secret for 10,000 years, would be killed trying to prevent something he actually wanted to happen. He knew all of this, and he allowed it to occur because the trap required it. The bait had to be real. The battle had to be genuine. The defenders had to fight and die in earnest, because if the defense of Molech appeared staged or half-hearted, Horus would have suspected a trap and avoided it. This is the Emperor at his most chilling. Not a benevolent father, or not a golden god of light and hope, but a strategist of such inhuman brilliance and such terrifying coldness that he would sacrifice millions of his own people, would allow an entire world to burn, would watch his most loyal servant die, all to ensure that his rebellious son walked into a trap that had been set before the son was even born. It is, in its own dark and terrible way, the most impressive feat of strategic thinking in the history of the Warhammer 40k universe. And it all began on Molech. It all began with a one-way ship and a gate that led to hell and a bargain that may or may not have been struck with gods, who may or may not have been tricked by the only being in the universe they truly feared. And so we come to the end of this story, or rather, to the point where this particular chapter of the story closes and the next one begins. Because Molech's influence on the Warhammer 40k universe does not end with the Horus heresy. It echoes forward through 10,000 years of blood and darkness and desperate hope, touching every major event in the lore, shaping every conflict, informing every decision. Let us trace those echoes, because they are worth following to their logical conclusions. The primarchs, created with knowledge gained on Molech, went on to become the most important figures in human history, for better and for worse. The ones who remained loyal formed the foundation of the Imperium that endures to this day. Robute Guilliman, the Avenging Sun, whose Codex Astartes would define the organization of the Space Marines for 10,000 years. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terror, whose fortifications held the Imperial Palace against the full fury of Horus's assault. Sanguinius, the Angel, whose death at the hands of Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit remains the single most heartbreaking moment in all of Warhammer 40k lore. Each of these loyal primarchs carried within them the warp energy that the Emperor had drawn from the gate on Molech. Each of them shone brightly in the Imperium, beacons of order and purpose in a dimension of chaos, and each of them paid a price for that brightness. in the form of curses, flaws, and burdens that would haunt their legions for millennia. The Blood Angels carry the red thirst and the black rage, genetic curses that transform the noblest warriors in the Imperium into blood-crazed monsters. The Space Wolves carry the curse of the Wolfen, the beast that lurks beneath the surface of every son of Fenris, threatening to consume their humanity and reduce them to something feral and savage. The Dark Angels carry the shame of the fallen, the terrible secret that some of their brothers turned traitor, as a secret that has defined and distorted their chapter culture for 10,000 years. All of these curses, all of these flaws, can be traced back to the warp energy that was woven into the primarchs during their creation, energy that the Emperor acquired on Molech. The traitor primarchs paid an even greater price. Horus himself was destroyed utterly, his soul eradicated by the Emperor's final psychic strike on the Bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, as so completely annihilated that even the Chaos Gods could not put him back together. Mortarion became a demon prince of Nurgle, trapped in a grotesque parody of his former self, a being of plague and despair who rules over a world of perpetual sickness. Fulgrim, the perfectionist, the aesthete, the primarch who had once been devoted to the pursuit of beauty and excellence, became a demon prince of Slaanesh, the serpentine monstrosity consumed by sensations that no mortal mind was designed to process. Magnus the Red, the scholar, the sorcerer, the primarch who had only ever wanted to understand the universe, was broken and remade into Tzeentch's plaything, a being of immense psychic power and equally immense sorrow. Each of these transformations can be traced back to the warp energy that made the primarchs what they were, but the same energy that gave them their extraordinary abilities also made them vulnerable to corruption. The gift and the curse were two sides of the same coin, and that coin was minted on Molech. The Golden Throne itself, the ancient device that keeps the Emperor alive, that powers the Astronomicon, that holds shut the ruptured webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace, is a monument to the consequences of Molech. The Emperor sits upon it because he was wounded by Horus, and a Horus empowered by the same gate the Emperor had used. The wound that refuses to heal, the body that refuses to die, the mind that refuses to rest, all of it traces back to a green world with jungles and night houses and a portal buried deep underground. Even the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psykers, the souls fed to the Golden Throne to sustain the Emperor's failing body, is a consequence of Molech. Without the primarchs, there would have been no Horus heresy. Without the Horus heresy, there would have been no siege of terror. Without the siege, the Emperor would never have been wounded. Without the wound, there would be no need for the Golden Throne. And without Molech, there would have been no primarchs. And there is yet another layer to this story that is often overlooked, but is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of all. The Emperor's journey to Molech represents a fundamental paradox at the heart of the Warhammer 40k universe. The Imperium of mankind, the greatest bastion of order and human civilization in the galaxy, the entity that defines itself in opposition to chaos, was built using tools that were forged in the realm of chaos itself. The primarchs, the space marines, the entire military apparatus that holds the Imperium together, all of it can be traced back to a moment when the Emperor chose to engage with the very forces he swore to destroy. This is not hypocrisy. It is something more complex and more tragic than hypocrisy. It is the recognition that sometimes, to fight a monster, you must become a little monstrous yourself. Sometimes, to protect the light, you must walk willingly into the darkness and take something from it. Sometimes, the only way to build a wall against the flood is to use the very water that threatens to drown you. The Emperor understood this. He understood it with the cold clarity of a being who had spent 10,000 years watching humanity struggle against forces it could barely comprehend. Yet he knew that the primarchs would be vulnerable to corruption. He knew that the warp energy he was weaving into their souls would attract the attention of the Chaos Gods. He knew that some of his sons would fall, that some would turn against him, that the very tools he was creating to save humanity could become the instruments of its destruction. He knew all of this, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was to do nothing, and to sit on the sidelines while humanity stumbled blindly toward extinction, too scattered and too weak and too ignorant to save itself from the darkness that was closing in on all sides. There is a line in the lore, spoken by one character or another in various forms across multiple novels, that captures this idea perfectly. The Emperor did not choose the least costly option. He chose the least costly option that had any chance of working. The primarchs were flawed. The Great Crusade was violent. But the Imperium was authoritarian and intolerant. None of these things were what the Emperor would have chosen in an ideal universe. But the universe was not ideal. It was a place of predators and prey, of darkness and desperate survival. And the Emperor was a pragmatist above all else. He would use whatever tools were available to him, even tools that came at a terrible price, because the alternative was to use no tools at all and watch his species die. This is the tragedy of Molech. Not that the Emperor made a deal with darkness, but that he had no choice. Not that the primarchs were flawed, but that flawed primarchs were better than no primarchs at all. Not that the Horus heresy happened, but that even the Horus heresy, with all its horror and all its death and all its 10,000-year legacy of suffering, was still a better outcome than the alternative. The alternative was extinction. The alternative was humanity consumed by the warp, devoured by aliens, scattered across a dying galaxy with no one to protect them and no hope of survival. The Emperor chose the lesser evil, and Molech was where that choice was made. There is also the question of what the Emperor's experience on Molech tells us about the nature of the Chaos gods themselves. Because the fact that the Emperor was able to enter the realm of chaos, negotiate or bargain or steal from the four most powerful entities in the Imperium, and walk out alive and enriched, it tells us something crucial about the dark powers. They are not omnipotent. They are not all-knowing. They can be tricked, outwitted, outmaneuvered. For all their vast power, for all their billions of years of accumulated malice and cunning, they are still, in some fundamental sense, predictable. They are slaves to their own natures. Khorne cannot help but respond to rage. Nurgle cannot help but respond to despair. Tzeentch cannot help but respond to ambition. Slaanesh cannot help but respond to desire. A being who understood these natures deeply enough, who could predict how each god would react to any given stimulus, could theoretically manipulate them, could play them against each other, could offer them exactly what they wanted while giving them nothing of real value. That is what the Emperor did on Molech. He read the Chaos gods like books. He understood their weaknesses better than they understood his strengths. Yet he walked into their domain with a plan so precise and so elegant that by the time they realized what had happened, he was already gone, carrying their knowledge in his mind and their fury at his back. He had stolen from the untouchable. He had outplayed the unplayable, and he had done it alone, armed with nothing but his own will and his own genius, and the desperate love of a father who would stop at nothing to protect his children, the species he had been born to save. But this is why the Chaos gods called him the Anathema. Not merely because his psychic power was harmful to them, though it certainly was. Not merely because his existence represented a threat to their dominion, though it certainly did, but because he had done something that should have been impossible. He had walked into their home, taken what he wanted, and left. And they could not stop him. They could not touch him. They could not corrupt him or tempt him or break him. He was beyond their reach in a way that no other being in the history of the galaxy had ever been. And that terrified them. It still terrifies them. 10,000 years later, sitting broken and dying on the Golden Throne, the Emperor is still the being they fear most, still the anathema, still the one force in the universe that they cannot fully predict or control. Because the man who walked through the gate on Molech and came back carrying the future of his species was not just powerful. He was something worse than powerful. From the Chaos God's perspective, he was purposeful, he was directed, he was a being of such absolute, unshakable conviction that even the combined might of 4 gods of corruption could not sway him from his path. Every thread leads back to that world. Every line of consequence, every chain of cause and effect, every tragedy and triumph in 10,000 years of galactic history can be traced if you follow the threads far enough. Back to the moment the Emperor stepped through that gate and walked into the domain of the Chaos Gods. That is why Molech matters. That is why the story of what happened there is arguably the single most important narrative in all of Warhammer 40k. Because everything, literally everything, flows from it. The Emperor saw something on Molech that changed everything. He saw the future. He saw the primarchs. He saw the Great Crusade, and the Horus heresy, and the Golden Throne, and 10,000 years of war and suffering, and desperate, stubborn, unbreakable human resilience. He saw it all, and he walked through the gate anyway, because he believed that the cost, however terrible, was worth paying for the survival of the species he had been born to protect. Whether he was right is a question that the lore invites but never answers. Whether the Emperor's gamble on Molech saved humanity or doomed it, whether the primarchs were worth the price, whether the Imperium that exists in the 41st millennium is the dream he envisioned or a nightmare he would not recognize. These are questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the beauty of the Molech story is not in the answers it provides, but in the questions it raises. Questions about the nature of sacrifice, the limits of wisdom, the price of power, and the terrible calculus that a being must perform when the survival of an entire species rests on the choices he makes. Molech is gone now, in a sense. The gate was used. The secret was revealed. The battle was fought and lost and won, depending on whose perspective you take. But the consequences endure. They endure in the golden light of the Astronomicon. They endure in the screaming of the warp. And they endure in the prayers of a billion human souls who look to the sky and whisper the name of a god who was once just a man. A man who walked through a door and came back carrying the future of his species in his hands. That is the story of Molech. That is what the Emperor saw. That is what changed everything. And if you found this exploration of one of Warhammer 40k's deepest and most fascinating mysteries as compelling as I did, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really does help more than you know, and it means I can keep making content like this for you. We have so much more lore to explore together, so many more stories to tell, so many more secrets buried in the dark corners of this incredible universe. Until next time, stay curious, stay immersed, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there is also a hell of a good story. I will see you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.